giant, irradiated ants, gruesome flesh-eating zombies, a man tied down beneath a swinging bladed pendulum. All of these have something in common. In this film, using a historical approach, we will examine to what extent the horror genre is a product of society's anxieties. We will, along the way, analyse how anxieties over the impending nuclear war manifested themselves through the horror movies of the 1950s. Look at the impact of the 1970s sexual revolution, and discover why films such as Hereditary, The Babadook, and Get Out are on our screens today. Due to the incredibly large scale of the horror genre, it would be an enormous task to tackle it in its entirety, and as a result, this video essay will be focusing mainly on the American film releases, and therefore some of the most significant American social and cultural issues of each decade. First, we must begin in the 19th century. The first horror film is widely considered to be Georges Miles's 1896 film Le Manoir du Diable, translated to English as The House of the Devil. This film features images of bats, castles, ghosts, and a demon, all of which are considered to be standard horror tropes to this day. Despite other releases such as The Haunted Castle in 1897, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in 1920, and Nosferatu in 1922, the genre's real boom took place during the 1930s, a decade which produced some of the most significant horror films ever made. Two of these were Dracula and Frankenstein. As scholar Kendall R. Phillips notes, this was just 3 years after the stock market crash of 1929. It was also in the midst of the rise of fascism in Central Europe, communism in the East, and rampant anti-Semitism throughout the Western world. America was also dealing with the aftermath of World War I, the Spanish flu pandemic, as well as the Great Depression. The monsters portrayed on screen offered an outlet for catharsis by allowing the audiences to indirectly address their anxieties. Frankenstein's monster is abandoned by his creator and rejected by his community. The monster can be seen as a reflection of the millions of Americans who had lost their jobs and were trying to escape the neglect from their government. Furthermore, writer R. Balon suggests that Count Dracula represents the corrupt and gluttonous mass of people, denizens of the Prohibition-era nightlife, that had become less than human after spending an entire decade indulging in the short-term pleasures of the flesh. With their fans stuck deep into the country's jugular, they bled the nation just as the Count does to his victims. Benjamin Wade also notes how these films represented an America that was afraid of a terrifying entity that was unstoppable. America felt powerless, and these monsters symbolised that lack of power. And in 1934, the lack of power was made clearer by the restrictions enforced by the Hays Code. This was the industry's first diligent attempt at removing salacious imagery from films. One rule stated that no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it. Towards the end of the 1930s and the beginning of the 1940s, producers had begun scrambling for new ideas and had conceived the idea of the monster mashup, also known as the monster rallies. This led to films such as Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman and Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. The 1940s essentially became the decade for recycling old formulas, providing films such as Son of Dracula, House of Frankenstein, and The Ghost of Frankenstein. Following the tragedy of World War II, America in the 1950s had the most powerful economy in the globe, and it seemed that the only real remaining threat was of nuclear annihilation, already witnessed with atomic bombs dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. As noted in an article by the BBC, the very real threat of nuclear war in the 50s and 60s inspired a doomsday era of horror, creating a what-if culture of giant monsters, space invaders, and science experiments gone wrong. This led to films such as The Creature from the Black Lagoon, featuring a monster created from pollution. Them, a movie about giant irradiated ants. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, in which an atomic blast causes a 140-million-year-old dinosaur to descend chaos onto New York City. And The Fly, a movie about a crazy scientist and a disastrous experiment. And then there was the Red Scare. This, as stated by Wade, was America's irrational descent into paranoia, centred on the idea that evil, undermining communists were infiltrating our society, posing as Americans. This created social anxiety, that there could be an enemy out there that looked just like them, which was reflected in the production of horror films such as The Day the Earth Stood Still and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The 1960s witnessed huge publicity of serial killers, as well as the assassinations of prominent leaders such as John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. There was also the continual backdrop of the violence and war crimes with the Vietnam War, exposing the brutal ways in which humans could harm one another. This brutality was mirrored in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, paving the way for the slasher cycle that would happen in the 1970s. The 60s also witnessed the height of counterculture, with protests against the rampant sexism and racism that was going on in America. This led to films such as The Night of the Living Dead, which, as discussed by Wade, may have been on the surface a zombie movie, but was really a mediation on racism and demonization of African Americans. In 1968, the Hays Code was finally dropped, leading to a more violent set of horror movies in the following decade, one that welcomed the beginning of the slasher cycle. A cycle, as defined by scholar Stephen Neal, is a group of films made within a limited period of time which exploits the characteristics of a commercially successful film. The most notable movies from the slasher cycle included The Last House on the Left, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Halloween. The 70s also dealt with the moral panic of the sexual revolution, the pill and its perceived effects on the American family. As a result, the ideal American family, particularly their prepubescent daughters, were constantly under threat in horror films, and often from satanic forces. The most famous example of this is the classic The Exorcist in 1973, a movie about the demonic possession of 12-year-old Regan McNeil. However, as noted by scholar Richard Nowell, despite its title, the film deals predominantly with the turbulent relationship of a lone mother and her adolescent daughter. Furthermore, as stated by scholar Sarah Arnold, pregnancy in horror is often equated with apocalyptic and religious narratives. Horror films such as It's Alive, released in 1974, and It Lives Again, released in 1978, depicted the monster as mutant babies, reflecting the anxiety of the time that birth control would cause serious birth defects. As an attempt to mimic the success of the filmmakers that were making horror movies for a few $100,000 and grossing millions at the box office throughout the 70s, the 1980s saw the release of the Paramount Pictures film Friday the 13th. This movie led the way for the film franchise, where studios would release endless sequels regardless of their quality or continuity. Since Friday the 13th's original release in 1980, there have been 10 subsequent sequels, including Friday the 13th Part 2, Friday the 13th Part 3, Friday the 13th The Final Chapter, Friday the 13th A New Beginning, and many more. A Nightmare on Elm Street followed this pattern, with 8 movies in its franchise, and Halloween, first released in 1978, began its series of 13 subsequent sequels and remakes in 1981 with Halloween Part 2. According to the AIDS Institute, from 1979 to 1981, rare types of pneumonia, cancer, and other illnesses were being reported by doctors among a number of patients who had sex with other men. And in 1982, public health officials began to use the term AIDS to refer to the illness caused by this virus. Horror became an outlet for exploring the fears and anxieties that surrounded this virus. One example was the 1982 film The Thing, which involved a blood test being used to determine whether someone was a thing. Another was 1986 film The Fly, which portrayed someone with a dangerous degenerative condition that slowly ate away at them. And another was The Prince of Darkness, which centered around Satan's spirit being exchanged through a liquid. By the 1990s, the well-worn tropes of the horror genre had evolved to the point of self-parody, and so a new, smart, self-aware subgenre was formed. The 1996 movie Scream is an excellent example of this, as it mirrors the tropes of the slasher movies whilst not taking itself too seriously. In 1999, the horror genre was once again flipped on its head, with the first film to effectively use a found footage technique. The Blair Witch Project was filmed by an amateur crew using off-the-shelf equipment and a budget of just $60,000. It has since become one of the most successful independent films ever made, making a cumulative worldwide gross of over $248 million. This triggered a new age of low-budget found footage movies in the 2000s. The found footage technique was reflective of technological changes, specifically the rise of smaller digital cameras, which allowed for cheaper and easier filmmaking. It also played on society's growing unease of a world that was increasingly taking place on camera, partly caused by the release of the first camera phone and the rise in popularity of reality TV in the 2000s. And as a result, 2007 saw the release of the home security camera style film, Paranormal Activity. The recent technological advances also meant that there were new possibilities for remaking the world. As scholar Kendall R. Phillips notes, there are many ways in which the remakes of classic films rewrites the politics of the earlier films. One example of this is the 2007 movie The Invasion, based on the 1956 Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in which the fear is updated to include references to our contemporary anxieties about 9/11, President George W. Bush, and the war in Iraq. The 2000s also saw the comeback of the splatter film, otherwise known as torture porn, with the Saw and Hostel franchises being the biggest torture porn movies of the decade. This type of body horror was a reaction to the US's enhanced interrogation and the increased use of government surveillance in the battle against terrorism. These films reflected an American society primed for fear and an escalated threat to the body. Cultural expert and film critic Aja Ramona notes how again and again horror films are choosing to forego allegory and metaphor in favour of the direct route. For example, a leaked image showing the abuse that was taking place in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq was mimicked in the film Hostel, in which a prisoner is stripped, hooded and tied up, directly evoking the leaked image. This explicit connection between on-screen horror and real-life pain is especially prevalent in the horror films of the recent decade. Author M. Owen discusses that, by popular consent, horror has been experiencing what critics label as a golden age. 2017 was the biggest year for ticket sales in the history of horror cinema, and in the following year the films Hereditary and A Quiet Place were both record-breaking successes. So what has happened in the recent decade to provoke this golden age of horror? Well, as Owen states, horror thrives on discombobulation, and today discombobulation is everywhere. And this is shown through the rise of mental health discussions. Society has become more and more open and recognising of mental health issues, and yet with worries about illnesses, depression, social anxiety and lack of supports to help people through difficult times, internal anxieties manifest externally. The rise in mental illness recognition has manifested in the horror genre through films such as The Ward, We Need to Talk About Kevin, Unsane and Split, which gained a worldwide gross of over $278 million. As previously discussed, technological advances have a huge impact on movies, and there has been two very important advances in the recent decade. One of which is the rise in streaming services. And in this era of streaming and binge watching, horror films have become among the most reliable profit drivers for studios, with smash hits such as Bird Box, The Nun, It, and Get Out, all available to watch on the streaming service Netflix. As discussed by Owen, the streaming revolution has given creditors a reliable and direct way to reach a dedicated, self-selecting audience. Trusting this audience, distributors like A24 and Blumhouse have put a great amount of both creative wherewithal and cold hard dollars into horror cinema. But as well as changing distribution, technology has itself become, increasingly, the object of fears and anxieties in society. Social media has created a loss of legitimate human connection, and in particular, a connection with family. Such miscommunication has become a prevalent theme throughout the recent horror movie releases. An example is the 2015 film The Witch, in which a family accuses their daughter of being a witch, and rather than communicating with her to hear her defence, they damn her without hesitation. Furthermore, Wade notes how in recent horror films, families are faced with devastating trauma and grief, but their inability and unwillingness to just talk about it threatens to tear the family apart and allows whatever evil forces at work to wreak havoc. This is portrayed in the 2014 movie The Babadook, which deals with the family's grief of losing their husband and father, 2018's Hereditary, which shows the stages of grieving the death of a daughter, and from the same year, A Quiet Place, which shows a family dealing with the death of their son. And just as Wade stated in these films, it is the lack of communication and recognition of each other's feelings that leads to their demise. The rise of social media has given companies a platform to spread fake news. As noted by Romano, white Americans' fears of faceless people of colour or the insidious invading corruption of foreign influences have been fueled by fake news, misinformation, and a web of vast and nefarious conspiracy theories. And this has shaped the current political climate to a degree few had imagined possible. She goes on to state that the cultural shift toward an overt courting of extremist right-wing ideologies was immediately evident in horror films. The most notable one to address this is 2017 Oscar-winning film Get Out. This was an extremely successful movie, being in Time magazine's top 10 films of the year. Vanessa Blanks notes how the film displays society's racist desire to control black people, and Thomas Jordan states that the film creates horror out of the experience of the black within society. In this movie, the white supremacist family are all brutally murdered as a consequence of their actions. This is notable because, as stated by Owen, current horror is shot through with the bone-deep knowledge that if we can't adapt, we will perish. Finally, it is important to discuss the impact of the film industry becoming slightly less dominated by men. In 2009, women directed just 7% of the top 250 grossing films that year, and in 2019, that percentage had risen to 13%. This has led to a small rise in female-helmed horror films which address the female experience. For example, The Babadook and Goodnight Mummy, both directed by women, explore the horrors of motherhood. The 2016 film Raw, directed by Julia Ducournau, explores female sexuality, and the 2015 film A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, directed by Anna Amirpour, tackles Iranian and American forms of misogyny. From this study, we have discovered that the horror genre is largely a reflection of the anxieties manifesting at any given time. Throughout the genre's history, it has been constantly shaped and redefined by changes in society, culture, politics, and technological advances. As media and cultural expert Professor Jason Wallin states, horror is not about the scare tactics so much as the unconscious fears. Horror is a speculation on a potential future, and it tries to elevate those anxieties to conscious thought. Furthermore, as stated by director John Carpenter, horror is a reaction, it is not a genre. And like a villain in a slasher movie, horror never really dies. It is lurking, waiting for the next opportunity to strike the hearts of society where it hurts them most, its anxieties.